Well, a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm Patrick Bowles, I'm The Economist foreign editor. We are here to talk about the most important friendship in the world. And it's not Donald Trump and Elon Musk. It's the world's largest economy and its fifth biggest economy. And probably by the time Donald Trump's term in office finishes, assuming he has a full term, it will be the world's third biggest economy. And there's something about this relationship that's special. And a few glimpses from how I see it. I was in Mumbai in December, and two things struck me. One was the harbour road was finally finished, so I could drive from the airport to the harbour in 25 minutes, which was just kind of mind-blowing, like a miracle. But the other thing is virtually no one I met expressed any reservation or concern about Donald Trump. You can also see it here at Davos, India with a massive presence, and also India very comfortable with this new world that we're faced with. And I was talking to Chandra at Tata yesterday, and we were discussing how the Tata chai stand on the promenade, if you passed it, like big queues, you know, it's sort of India on top. And then lastly, of course, we have what's happened over the last few days where everyone's trying to interpret the signals, but we know that Foreign Minister Jaishankar was at the inauguration, that he spoke to Marco Rubio, and that I think Prime Minister Modi referred to Donald Trump as his dear friend, and they have a close relationship. So all of that is set up, I think, as India being special in a world where almost all other countries are worried about America under Donald Trump. India isn't, and we're going to test that hypothesis, talk about the opportunities and also some of the risks. Now, before we do that, I'd like to get our amazing panel here to introduce themselves to you. We've got a fantastic suite of people, and Walter, why don't you go first?
Okay, well, I'm Walter Mead. I'm a completely unqualified dilettante and hack, especially about India. But I'm a persistent dilettante and hack. Learning more about India has been really one of the big intellectual adventures for me the last few years.
Walter, I think you've just defined the job of a journalist, by the way.
Walter's being modest here, but he is very much a loved figure in India, and people in the Modi team trust him and want him to be speaking for India. I've had a slight voice problem, but I'm Asha Jadeja. I'm a venture capitalist based in San Francisco, investing not just in Silicon Valley, that 90% of my investments are, but also investing in India and Israel now. We are a small family office and a venture fund. We also have the Motwani Jadeja Foundation, which does a little bit of philanthropic work. Increasingly, we are focusing on establishing deeper ties between US and India on defense, technology, climate, and women's entrepreneurship.
I'm Nadir Godrej. I'm the chairman and managing director of Godrej Industries, which is part of the Godrej Industries groups. We have FMCG businesses, chemical businesses, agri-businesses, and property development. We are a conglomerate determined to grow our business sustainably in every sense of the word.
Hi, my name is Lakshman, and everyone calls me CTL. I live in Dallas, and I am responsible for the Americas for Tech Mahindra and the Mahindra Group. Right, and Mahindra Group's presence in the US is growing. Our tractors are now the third largest selling tractors in the US. And we opened up a plant in Detroit, and I'm very proud to say that that was the first automotive plant in Detroit after 10 years. They make a rugged off-road vehicle called the Rockstar. Right. So thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Garcetti. I am the immediate past, this is my first time saying this, ambassador of the United States to India. This is my first trip away from India, where I still live and will be until June. But just coming off of 2 extraordinary years serving as our representative of the United States in India at the most consequential, most interesting time in a relationship that I fully agree with you, Patrick, is the defining relationship of the, I would say, next quarter of this century.
Okay, well, why don't we get started? And before we delve into some of the verticals, manufacturing, tech, security, maybe we can just quickly test that everyone roughly agrees with the hypothesis, and also what lies behind India, US being special. Eric, would you like to?
Sure. I just wrote my outgoing cable to the former president and the incoming president. It's one of the traditions of being an ambassador. You kind of summarize everything that this moment is about. And
is it the same cable to both men? Or
it is the same.
Did you have to simplify?
Dear Joe and
the second
Tom.
one had pictures, right?
Yeah, it's same language, but a few more swear words in the second one. But. So in this, I said this was 3 C's. It was the most compelling, sometimes challenging, consequential relationship in the world. Compelling because our hearts and I think our souls kind of breathe and feel alike more than they ever have before. I would also argue that our heads strategically think alike more than they have before. Challenging because the question is, can we get our feet aligned to move together, and how quickly? And I think that it's an incredibly resilient relationship, and we can go into detail, but whether it's challenges over the last 2 years or before, nothing derails this. In fact, it's the opposite. It doesn't matter who's in power in India. It doesn't matter who's in power in the United States. There is genuine advantage to the warmth that President Biden and Prime Minister Modi had, genuine advantage in the relationship, obviously, that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have. But it is also the reflection of their people, not just something that leaders are courageous about. In the old days when you were a diplomat who would cross over with a country that most of your people didn't want to be close with. Americans love Indians. We're becoming less ignorant about India. There's a great awakening happening from the private sector to just the everyday American to obviously in the government sector, because we don't have many people who know India, very few Indianologists. I started studying India and visiting there when I was 14, took Hindi in Urdu in college. People said, why? Even today, when you go to the State Department, our intelligence services, defense, there's very few people who understand India. But at the same time, I think President Biden's words when he asked me to take the job were, this is the most important country in the world to me. And I was repeating the story. I said, you say that to everybody, Joe. Say that to the Liechtenstein ambassador. But he said, no, really, kid, I'm not, no joke, pal. And he said it privately to Prime Minister Modi, and I know he hasn't said it to anybody else. That is a shift. It is not just an interesting relationship, a critical relationship. I would offer it as the critical relationship for the counterbalancing of the world, realigning of our supply chains, figuring out some security issues, and defining the intelligence and technology that will define our future.
Asha, do you want to dig into what makes this special? I mean, obviously there's India's side and all that kind of stuff, but there's also the role of relationships, the diaspora. Talk to us about that.
So I think there are 2 triggers, Patrick, and in this what is set up. What has set this relationship, on some kind of a meteoric rise? There are 2. One, of course, is the diaspora, and the diaspora becoming influential in the U.S. That's one thing. Second, of course, is China. So the pivot from China has developed a momentum in this relationship, which, I think, initially was a little bit transactional. It was more about how do we get, the supply chains, how do we get more defense, how do we get, better naval coordination and things like that in the beginning. But after that, what I'm seeing happening both, at the levels of ISET, the Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies, and for the Quad, is a deeper understanding that these are 2 nations bound by values, by a same set of values of democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and globalization. So I think these triggers are what has set this relationship on a course that we've never seen before. I'm super excited about this relationship because as a venture capitalist, I'm seeing not just opportunities that are going to arise in, especially in defense, but I'm also seeing, these opportunities rising in semiconductors, in new kinds of software, of course, AI and AI regulation that will be jointly developed between the 2 nations.
Okay, we're going to just stick with defining this specialness a little bit more. How do the Indian public see Mr. Trump? What's your read on that?
I'll say something about the relationship first.
Sure.
Now, China is still growing fast, but not as fast as in the past. Their customers are getting wary, but retaliation will be scary. Donald can loudly talk, but what will be his actual walk? High China tariffs have been mooted. For others, this could be well suited, but Musk could help to mitigate. What will transpire is hard to state. Trump might also take the call to raise tariffs for one and all. During COVID, one could not rely on China and had to diversify, but nevertheless, China leads. In some areas, someone else succeeds. Vietnam is often doing well. In India, too, we can export and sell large quantities of mobile phones. And India now steadily hones high-tech manufacturing skills. Production-linked incentive fills the coffers needed to expand. Much can be done with this in hand. For greater exports, there is much scope. But it's not enough to rely on hope. Our own tariffs are rather high. It's possible that the US might try retaliatory strategies. Proactively, we should decrease our tariffs and ward off the threat. On more exports, we should bet. But we should always bear in mind there could be surprises that we'll find.
I'm not sure if there's any need for us to continue this. The job's kind of done. But I should I should have made clear to all the panelists that all your answers need to be in rhyming verse. Apologies. Clarification. Okay, we're going to come on to tech in a second, but just before, Walter, how does Team Trump view India versus Team Biden? So is it just complete continuity, or is there a different lens?
I think there is great continuity in the sense that both groups see India as critical to the whole development of the Indo-Pacific, and in a sense critical to the ability of the United States and friends like India to manage a difficult relationship with China without moving toward war. I sometimes look back at statistics that say that in about 1980, the Indian GDP was 65% of China's. Today, it is about 17% of China's. And in that gap, that is the imbalance of power in the Indo-Pacific that is sort of ultimately responsible for a lot of the sort of crisis atmosphere, disturbance, and maybe excessive ambition on the part of China. So that in that sense, there's an American strategic interest in the growth of India, almost apart from policy of India. If India today were 50% of China's GDP, the situation in Southeast Asia would be quite different. China would be scaling back ambitions, not because an American fleet was off the shore, but because Asia was too diverse, too dynamic, too rich for even a country like China to seriously hope to control the future. And I think the Trump people and the Biden people at a certain level both see that. They both also see the potential for India and the US in tech to really have some complementarities and be able to do some things together that neither of us might be able to do alone. I think the Trump people may be a little bit more conscious of India's potential as a stabilizing force in the Middle East. That the fact that India has such excellent relations with so many of the Gulf states plus Israel is a very significant factor that I think will become more significant in the future. And India's, the fact that there is now a Hindu temple in the UAE is a sign of how the recognition by Arab nations in the Gulf of the importance of the Indian relationship leading to a kind of a willingness to move beyond some old limitations and doctrinaire positions. That's a real contribution to peace in a region of great importance to the United States. And I think finally, where some of the disagreements have been between India and the US in the last 4 years, some of those have been about regional architecture and neighbors. Bangladesh, I don't think U.S.-India policy was always perfectly aligned.
Yep.
There are certainly other cases like that. I think the Trump people will likely be somewhat more eager to resolve those differences, but it's hard to say. This is very early times. The policy in the Trump universe, the personnel is not settled, much less the policy. And as we all know, the new president of the United States, the once and future president of the United States, is a person who's capable of tearing up everything that was done up until last month and launching off in completely new directions. So it's going to be very important for India to pay attention to the currents and cross currents in Congress as well as in the executive and in both parties, because the relationship does need to remain a bipartisan relationship. But I think there are few countries in the world as well placed as India to have successful relations with the United States under a Trump presidency.
Okay, one question we left unresolved before we dive into tech, just to confirm, particularly for people here who are not as familiar with India, what's the Indian public perception of Modi? Trump. Modi's a different question.
It's very positive.
Yeah.
And, you know, Americans, it's interesting, India is, with Poland and Israel, the three countries that have the highest opinion of Americans.
Yeah.
In fact, when I briefed President Biden, said, good news, Mr. President, you know, Americans poll higher in India than they do in America. And it was true. Like, if you look at about 80% of Indians have a positive view of Americans. I don't think 80% of Americans have a positive view of Americans right now. So there's a reservoir of goodwill. It comes also from a deep connection, especially among Indian elites, of children, connections, the companies. You know, there's co-investment, and it's changing the narrative too. It's not just American companies investing in India anymore, it's vice versa. And I think Trump is seen as somebody who is close to Modi, and that's important, and also somebody who speaks in a way that's familiar to Indians. I think on trade, to have a blunter conversation, while there can be a thin-skinnedness sometimes among Indian officials, it's the right way to start negotiations in India. At a store, you don't dance around a price, you go right at it in India. And Americans aren't comfortable doing that. So to learn to negotiate like an Indian, I think Trump already does.
Okay,
Good, very good.
so why don't we dive into, probably along with security, the single most important bit of the relationship, which is tech. And CTL, describe to us how you're thinking about this kind of techno-nationalism in America, and whether it's good or bad for India's IT services industry, for whom the US is the key market.
Thank you. You know, I serve on the board of the US IBC, which is a part of the US Chamber of Commerce. So we followed this closely from the Trump 1.0 to President Biden, and now hopefully we think we can predict 2.0. Asha spoke about ISET. There's already tremendous collaboration going on between both countries at the highest levels, saying that why are we reinventing the wheel? The big elephant in the room is China, right? And if you look at, some time ago, they manufactured products at a reasonable quality, at scale, right, and delivered on time. If you talk about China now, they're talking about producing at scale at the highest quality. So this is real serious competition, right? And so from our perspective, how can both countries collaborate together? India has got the scale from a demography perspective, right? And so with that, how can the US tap into that? So this is one. The second is, I think what India can add in terms of higher end value. And I'm going to give you an example. Our Mahindras have a factory in the outskirts of Pune. 13,000 people come to work every day. In the last 3 years, we've been implementing technologies like AI, augmented reality, virtual reality, computer vision to make the factory safer, intuitive, intelligent, and energy efficient. 3 years down the line, that factory consumes 30% lesser energy to manufacture a vehicle than it did 3 years ago. Now, so we said, why don't we come back and look at US factories? We work with Fortune 1000 companies in the US, and we looked at number of factories, and they're way behind. So now we're creating a digital platform which can be hosted on the cloud and offered to the rest of the world, right? Not just the US, but the rest of the world. But this would mean that it's a great sustainability story. It's going to reduce cost of manufacturing in the US, which President Trump wants so badly, right? And so we have lots of wins going on. So you'll see a lot more IP, higher-end IP, thought leadership emerge out of India. That will make the US manufacturing much more competitive. And I think that's something that the US is going to like quite a bit.
And how do you... So in response to that, surely the message from the Trump administration is also America first, preference for American companies, government support for American companies. So how do you think they view partnering with foreign companies in the way you've described? That's really the crucial question here. Are they open or are they actually closed?
Actually, very open. Right? It's a complementary skill, right? What I don't have, somebody else is able to bring to the table. And that somebody else who's bringing to the table is a trusted partner, right? A friend-shoring country, as we call them now, right? And so we've seen a lot of openness in the part of customers who are looking at solutions like these. And from a government cooperation perspective, I think we've had all the cooperation. The only thing is, Germany bought 56% of its energy from Russia, and they thought they had no problems. You come back to the US, one of our largest customers, their single largest market is the US, 92% of their sourcing is China. It's a bad word, no one wants to talk about it, right? And so, that has to change. And a year and a half ago, we started doing it. We moved this, and we moved this to India, Mexico, Malaysia, all these countries. And what we learned was that it's not easy. China is way ahead in this game. A year ago, we all said, and even today, statements like, China +1, or we're done with China, those are not good statements, right? There's a word called purposeful decoupling. China is making its move. They've done a Silk Route. They've got into new markets. So it's good for the world to get balanced, right? And so technology will play a big role in shifting supply chains and giving confidence, right? And that's a work that Tech Mahindra, which is the technology arm of the group, is very deeply involved with.
And just one more question on Tech Mahindra. So the IT services business specifically, is that going to grow faster under a Trump world than under the status quo world, or not? That seems an important question.
Well, I'm very optimistic. Generally the sentiment from all the CEOs that we've talked to is it's business friendly, right? And if it's business friendly, we are good. There's a lot of value that we add to our customers in the US, and we sell on merits, as compared to anybody else. So the general feeling, I was at the Wall Street Journal CEO conference, and 86% of the CEOs said that we are very positive, irrespective of which part of the aisle they are from.
Remarkable intellectual agility on behalf of the CEOs. But point taken. Asha.
I just wanted to add to CTL's point that yes, there have been a few hiccups, Patrick, to your questions about has there been techno-nationalism about H-1B visas and about bringing the jobs to the middle America and things like that. I think to counterbalance that anxiety, what's really interesting in this new Trump administration is there's a very strong participation by Silicon Valley in the Trump administration. So it's not just driven by Elon Musk, but it's also driven by Mark Andreessen, who is right now sitting in Mar-a-Lago, interviewing all kinds of new appointees in the Trump administration. With people like Mark Andreessen sitting there, and at least 8 of us who are playing some kind of peripheral role in Mar-a-Lago, I think what we are going to see is there's going to be a lot of pushback against this whole idea that we don't need that talent from India. We do need the talent. We need the cheaper talent. That's the truth. The Silicon Valley and Seattle, between Amazon, Microsoft, and all these countries have tremendous pressure to be competitive on the global scale, and they will need that partnership with Indian engineers and even with Indian companies.
So do you think Musk has won the argument on H-1B
He's completely on this H-1B board.
And when you think about that alliance between the kind of tech plutocrats and the MAGA movement, it doesn't feel that stable to me.
No, you're right. you're right that it's a challenge.
How does that, particularly this thing over visas, which is very, very important for the IT business, how stable is that? You could see that flipping, I think.
I think the Indians are realizing that they cannot continue playing this role of sort of, how do we get more Indian engineers into these companies and this and that. They will have to create ways in which they establish presence of Indian companies in the Midwest, in the middle of America, where they create jobs. I'm actually already looking at one company that's planning to do that in education and in skill development. So there is a sort of an understanding on the Indian side that unless they bring value to Middle America, this whole, wonderful virtuous cycle that we have may not last for long.
And if you look at just on tech, if you look at the other end, so you've got massive labor pool, right? That's one part of tech. The other part is entrepreneurs, startups, intellectual capital, frontier technology.
Right.
Do you think India will enjoy and continue to enjoy full access to America, the kind of connectivity it's historically been used to?
It will continue, Patrick, simply because there is such a strong tie between Bangalore and Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people who are in the valley are often working in, Google, Mountain View would be working in Google India, or, Palantir would be, somebody from Palantir would be working in Hyderabad. So there is such a back and forth between the Indians in Silicon Valley and Bangalore that I don't see that. I mean, it's rock solid now. I don't see anything disturbing that equilibrium. But that said, you're right about in the MAGA movement, there is that sense that are we giving up too many of our mid-level jobs to foreign engineers?
I find J.D. Vance the most fascinating character in this because,
right.
his wife leads in one direction and his ideology leads in another. He may turn out to be the crucial figure. Now, talk to us about China Plus One manufacturing in India is clearly part of this puzzle, and yet many economists look at what India has achieved, and obviously there are successes like the iPhone, but are a bit underwhelmed by the kind of made in India drive. Talk to us about that.
Yes. Lakshman already mentioned that China is a formidable challenge. During the pandemic, their supply chains were disrupted and was quite a good opportunity for us. But they are back. And they have massively expanded their scale, which makes them very economical. And we also suspect that when they have excess capacity, they do not hesitate to cut prices, maybe at unprofitable levels, to keep exporting. So we have to bear that in mind, that they are a formidable challenge, but there is a lot of opportunity. Wherever technology was required in manufacturing, like in pharmaceuticals and specialty chemicals, India was always well positioned. And those opportunities will still be very good for India. But India will have to keep on trying, keep on bringing down its cost, and some of what he said about newer technologies, artificial intelligence, more sustainability, more energy efficiency, all this can help India, but we shouldn't forget that it's not an easy task to replace China. But if we get 10 or 20% of China's business,
you're in business,
and somebody wants sometimes people are willing to pay a slightly higher price to have an option, then India will have a lot of opportunities.
And how would you characterize the scale of what's happened so far in terms of this sort of supply chain moving?
Some of it is happening.
Yep.
Some of it is happening, but China is still very strong, and we can't deny that.
No, I have one good point to add. What happened was when we moved the supply chain for this $1 billion worth, 60% of it went to India, 30% went to Mexico, and then the others, Malaysia and Vietnam. When we moved it, we thought suppliers would be standing in queue. This was in the hand tool space. Right, we couldn't find suppliers because I understand everyone is busy servicing the local market, which is so big, right? And so then we had to use Mahindra's supplier ecosystem. Finally, we outsourced, and then we found that those suppliers were buying 50% of the electrical components from China, right? So some ecosystems are developed, like automotive, end to end. Yep. We are world class. Global vaccine, 60% of global vaccine that the world needs is from India. So, and if you're talking about Apple iPhones, 20% of Apple's iPhones are made from India. So we know how to get it right. So we were with the Honorable Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, and we told her this. We said the last 4 decades was IT. The next 4 decades will be manufacturing. But the Indian business will need support. right? Look at the control China has on rare earth materials, right? So we have to find there are difficult problems to solve, but we must solve them because they're difficult.
Okay, so why don't we turn to security and defence, which is the crucial bit of this. And Walter, talk to us about how India manages to in one sense, be non-aligned and have a distinct position that is separate from the West, and at the same time be the essential ally in the coming decades. I mean, this is at the heart of the ambiguity, really, of India's foreign policy. Maybe its strength, maybe not. But talk to us about that, squaring that circle.
Well, India has a unique geography and a unique history that lead it to see the world in certain ways quite logically. So, if you are close to both Russia and China, it's very much in your interest to try to keep the two of them apart. And if one of them seems to be overbearing and threatening, you definitely want to work with the other. On top of that, you have the history, as E.M. Jaishankar has said. We've never had harm from our relations with Russia, with Soviet Union or Russia. There's a very long history. You can look at places like Afghanistan and so on, where they're very natural and important partnerships. And for India, in some ways, the West's isolation of Russia following Russia's invasion of Ukraine was in itself a foreign policy disaster, in that it pushes Russia much more closely to China, and in a sense even to Pakistan. And for India, the idea of a Russia-China-Pakistan bloc, that's a terrible nightmare, right? And from a Washington perspective, that might just be a sort of a sad byproduct of an otherwise necessary choice. Or I was recently in Arunachal Pradesh in Tawan, and as I said in my newspaper column, by the way, yak meat is overrated.
You didn't have it prepared right.
That must be it, right? It was fascinating to see there, just drove home to me that India needs extremely good relations with Bangladesh in order to have any military option whatever in terms of defending the Northeast, where China has substantial territorial claims, where you have the civil war in Myanmar, Burma, creating all kinds of instabilities in what is already a rather tribal, polarized environment in certain parts of India. And so for India, relationships with Bangladesh are a strategic question. There's a tendency in parts of the U.S., I think, to look at it almost in a more ideological fashion. Do we like the government? And so the two countries might come following their own instincts and their own strategic visions to a different position on various issues. And that's natural, normal. It doesn't mean that India is being sort of rude and horrible, and actually doesn't mean America is being imperialist and rude. It's a normal thing for countries to start from where they stand and think about the world in those terms. But then on the other hand, there are increasingly Americans do understand that India's ability to defend its Northeast is an important American national interest. And so we should be giving a higher priority to the big picture there, which, by the way, doesn't mean encouraging rulers who are involved in what looks increasingly like self-destructive behavior. It doesn't mean sort of passively accepting everything, but it would mean working much more closely with India on thinking things through together with India more, I think. And then there are ways in which Indian thinking is visibly changing. I can remember not many years ago when you brought up the subject of Taiwan in India, boredom and yawns were basically what you got. This is a very long way away. This is not an Indian problem. We have enough problems with China right in our own backyard to be worried, to be adding issues that are thousands of miles away. But now, I think, and now when you talk about Taiwan with people in India, what people are hearing is, if China decided one morning it wanted to blockade Taiwan and commerce stops, and likely the Western ally, the US and Japan and others would face questions, do we impose a counter blockade on China? Do we try to break the Chinese blockade on Taiwan with humanitarian shipments, food, medicine, fuel, and so on? Whatever those decisions are, the impact on India's economy would be enormous. Is trade going to be cut off with China, from Japan? Is there going to be some sort of worldwide economic conflagration around that crisis? Well, Indians increasingly feel, when those conversations are held, India needs to be at that table and have a voice that is listened to and have our views respected, because we have interests in this situation. And if you want to be at the table, people don't just give you a place at the table. You have to earn that. You have to be part of a group in order to be part of the discussions that group has. And so some of the strengthening of Indian cooperation with the Quad and increased understanding of the importance of India-Japan ties and so on and so forth are very much linked to this increasing scope of, look east, of an Indian foreign policy that is taking account of, again, not American interests, not doing something about Taiwan because it is an American interest, but wanting to be part of the solution, because if you're not, Indian interests are going to be seriously affected.
Okay, well, I've put together a list of things that might go wrong, and I'm about to ask you all to respond to that. But just before I do, Eric, a couple of years ago, I was with the team of American diplomats going around Asia. This is security officials, and the final stop was India. This was just before Modi's visit. Yep. And they were talking about this vision of India becoming the defense industrial base of Asia for American allies, for much closer sharing of intelligence and equipment and so on. Just tell the audience how close to that vision we've got and what progress was made of the last couple of years.
Well, first of all, Walter was right on with the analysis that you just gave, I think, across the board. Because one of the things we forget to do is to center India. If you look at our military commands, we have Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command, which ends on one side of India, Central Command, which ends on the other. So if you ever look at the maps they use, India's there on the margins, usually where the legend is. And we don't build maps from South Asia out. We don't think like India or the region out. When it is not just a subcontinent, I would argue it's a continent. I mean, imagine Europe becomes a single country. That is India. Imagine Southeast Asia becomes a single country. That is India. In terms of, obviously, population is greater than Europe, greater than Southeast Asia, but that cultural diversity, the complexity, and the neighbors that are around them. So you really have to center India first. Then you have to understand India, which we've been talking about. I mean, Americans are horribly ignorant, I think, about the history, the culture, the perspectives, and that diversity. And then you have to engage India. And one of the ways we've been engaging is on this defense industrial axis, also space. And I would say space, aerospace, and defense are critically important areas for US and India to solidify our relationship, which, as I used to say, if it was Facebook status for a long time, we had it's complicated. Now we've definitely moved the dial to we're dating. Asha and I have dreams that one day we'll get married, but you cannot use the word marriage, which is ally in strategic. So when we have Marco Rubio...
There's commitment issues here.
Well, when you're the prettiest girl or guy at the dance, you like being that, right? You want to dance with everybody or be asked to dance with everybody, and you have history with people too. So, India's in a very attractive place to a lot of different countries, with a couple exceptions. That said, in understanding how we do that defense integration, it's really critical that we look at the ways where America and our industrial base in defense will fall short. and where India can beautifully tomorrow, when you look at vehicles, when you look at some of the weaponry, when you look at other things, could not only produce kind of the old school industrial base weapons, but as war itself. I remember being in the Oval Office with President Biden, who turns to President Modi, typical of two leaders who like each other. It was a 5-minute meeting that turned into 45 minutes, where about a half hour of that was them just talking about President Xi and their experiences. But about 10 minutes of it was President Biden saying the next 10 years will redefine war more than the last 100 years has. And if you want to look at a networked, 90% accurate weaponry at a much cheaper price than the 10x weapon that is 100% accurate, and if you look from Houthis, Ukrainians, and Russians, the way war is fundamentally transforming. India is actually the place with the engineers, the kind of startup culture, the intellectual capital, and just the heft to be able to become a place. Think about what Turkey did to transform itself into a place that manufactures arms and defense systems. Imagine India doing that and doing it well. Now, there's a lot to change in both places. We gave India the most exquisite jet fighter engines ever made, F414s. We don't share that with some of our closest allies. That was part of that trip and the part of it. But when Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, is still a state-owned enterprise, said, okay, GE, now it's a discussion between two companies, how do you make this? And GE said, well, we don't make it. Our suppliers do. We design it and we assemble it. And Hindustan Aeronautics is like, well, we're going to make it soup to nuts. And GE said, you can't. I mean, you can, maybe you can, but kind of that difference of how you need to have not just great people at the top, the Mahindras, the Tatas, who have always done a fabulous job, but the middle level and then the startup culture. So I'd say one of the best leave-behinds we have that I know the Trump administration is picking up is Indus X, which is India-US Defense Exchange, in which we're putting out problems. For instance, our Space Force put out a problem. Indian startups won those bids. And then really doing the supply chain work so that India can manufacture things like they do for our fuselages, for Apache helicopters, for our C-130s already. And we need to intertwine the supply chain so that India needs things from the US needs things from India, and the whole world can buy them more cheaply from India when they can't get the top shelf, usually not available anytime soon, 100% accurate but very expensive systems from America.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So we're going to go through the list of things that could go wrong, and along with the rule that you have to reply in rhyming verse, there is the rule that you have to reply to at least one of these. Some of these are more difficult and sensitive issues, but let's try and tackle them. So I want to start with the trade deficit. $45 billion. Pretty big. It's doubled since Trump was last in office. We know he cares about this. Who would like to explain why the trade deficit is not a problem?
Eric.
Well, I'll raise my voice. I think it's by choice. That was my attempt at a couplet. It is something that American companies, trade deficits aren't always negative. American companies have made the decision on services to have a lot of our services in India. There's an economy of scale there. There's a level of talent there. And that's not going to get undone. You can go through most Fortune 500 companies, and their largest employee group outside the United States for American companies is in India. That causes a deficit, but it also gives an advantage to those companies in global competitiveness. I do think, as was raised, this is the highest tariffed major economy in the world. I'm a huge cheerleader, as you know, for the US-India relationship and for companies to choose India who are American. But they will come to India because it's such a big market. But if you want to get the China +1 diversification, et cetera, water will flow like gravity where it flows. And until those tariffs come down further, until those non-tariff barriers, trademark protections, which are good in the courts, but there's no penalties for them. If you don't look at talent and training of the Indian workforce. I talked with a large laptop manufacturer, CEO came in, head of manufacturing was with him. They're in India. They said, we've been there for 6 years. We're taking advantage of all of the production and linked incentives in South India. He said, we're still not making money 4 or 5 years into this. We're committed, we'll do it. It'll take us 10 years, but we've got to report to our shareholders quarterly. And Indian local and state officials still look at us as, a golden goose that they can change the rules on overnight. The tax structures change. The workforce isn't as well trained as in China. It's cheaper, but that washes itself. I had a shoe company come in, Skechers, who wanted to bring $2 or $3 billion in. They said some of the ceramic manufacturing isn't in India that they needed, and India was going to tax that at 50% per and on a shoe. They said, we're just going to go to Vietnam, who, by the way, is building us a airport next to our facility. This was, for the electronics manufacturing. A 747 of Dell components comes into Vietnam, 747 of finished product goes out every day, and Vietnam's just building the airport next to their factory. That would be unimaginable probably today in India. So it's a very competitive environment, but I think that the trade deficit is, you shouldn't always look at it, Trump will, but as a negative. It's a choice that we have made, I think, most of our companies. But the Indian government should open up to agriculture, should open up to electronics manufacturing in a way that's mutually beneficial. Critical emerging technologies in particular will come in bulk to India, but you could get 2x and maybe 2 to 3 more points of economic growth for the next 20 years if India made some pretty radical shifts in the next 2 to 3 years.
Instead of being evasive, your answer was persuasive. Anyone else like to comment on the trade deficit? I mean, is this something that just basically needs to be diffused or contained as a point of friction?
A lot of it is with services.
Yeah.
And I don't think America can do without those services. So I don't think it's going to be a big issue, but I entirely agree with Eric that India needs to reduce its tariffs. Agriculture is a tricky situation for India because of farmers, and India would argue that America subsidizes agriculture. So that's going to be a tricky issue. And but Eric is right, we have to do something about that.
Okay, anyone else like to comment on that?
Just one quick,
Yep.
I think Trump wants India to buy more food, more processed food.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think could be a sticky point, but it's happening. I mean,
Trump uses the word reciprocity a lot when the subject of trade comes up. And I think it would be very helpful for India to try to construct whatever changes it wants to make with the idea of reciprocity in mind, so that it can engage in arguments in the same place that the Trump people are coming from.
Yeah, and both of them are deal makers. So if they put something in the pipe and smoke, something will come out of it, right?
That's the goal.
And if I
There's so much opportunity.
would offer-
Security ties, economic ties. If both these are, and trust, if these three are together, then you can, if like-minded people sit down together, there's no problem that's complex to solve.
And in two senses, we did this with the Biden administration, I briefed the Trump administration. We're pretty far along on the idea of a preferential trade and technology corridor. So keep it narrow, put it in critical, components and issues that will define our future, and get that deal done. Show India as a deal maker with the Trump administration, an example to the rest of the world. And I wouldn't be surprised if those discussions start in the next month or two.
Okay, next on the list, and I'm pretty confident only 2 people will go anywhere near this, Adani. So we have an American court that has essentially asked for an arrest and an extradition. What happens there?
Everybody wants to rhyme Adani and Ambani, right? Because that's natural. Who are the 2 that you predicted would jump into that?
I think.
You.
Oh, God.
I mean, and also,
I mean, I don't know whether. Sorry.
maybe I'll start, and Eric will give the finer details on this. But I think, as far as Adani and Ambani, those attacks, Patrick, are an attack on Modi, because they know that these are strongly aligned families with the Modi administration, and I think as there's an increasing recognition of the fact that this is not just about Adani, but it is about a certain ideological position, I think the battle would be easier to win.
I mean, presumably, without putting words in your mouth, the Trump administration is simply not going to issue an extradition request. And
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But Eric could throw some color on it.
So, sure. Look, I think one of the things that Indian analysts and sometimes government officials misread is that we have a completely independent judiciary system, or at least we have up to this point. We'll see moving forward. A completely independent judiciary system from our political ones, which in other countries, like, you can't have a president say once a prosecution has started or regulation happened, oh, don't do that anymore. Whereas in most countries you can, and they do. So I think this was, there was no conspiracy behind this. I'll say this, we need companies, whether it's Adani, whether it's Ambani, whether it's obviously Mahindra, Tata. We need companies like this around the world. Who else can do port infrastructure besides Chinese companies? Who else are going to be the shipyards of the future? We certainly don't have that capacity in the United States much anymore. Who else can we look at for non-Huawei telecoms equipment soon? Our silicon wafers and solar panels, our battery components. If it's not in India, I'm not quite sure where it's going to be. So there will always be regulation. We will always have our rules. Maybe we can look at examining those rules and whether they do well for us globally. But at the end of the day, I don't think that a company like Adani is going to go away, and its importance is not going to go away to America.
Okay, my uncomfortable questions are going to get even more uncomfortable.
Go.
Oh, wow.
Assassination. So we've had pretty credible allegations of an Indian intelligence operation in Canada and also touching the US. Is that something that can be diffused? And again, anyone is welcome to address this.
I could try that. Try my hands first.
Thanks, Sasha.
Simply because I cornered Jake Sullivan in Aspen, Colorado. I cornered him into something. I said, Jake, tell us about what is this? What do you think? Is this going to derail this relationship? And Jake said that right now we don't have any evidence. I mean, we cannot, authoritatively said that here is the evidence that this directly goes up the chain, up the food chain. So yes, even if there was a rogue bureaucrat who authorized something like this, there's no evidence for higher leakage. That's what Jake said. I don't know how it's,
And the bureaucrat was fired.
I'm waiting for Eric's answer to this.
Yes, and the bureaucrat was fired. That's right.
So 2 points I'll make. One is that the idea of attempted assassination by a friend, let alone, we might not be as surprised when it's a foe, but from a friend, that was obviously a red line that can never be crossed, that we are very clear cannot be crossed, that the system has to change to make sure it won't be crossed again, and there needs to be accountability. Or at least what our criminal justice system uncovered was clear evidence. And it's pretty irrefutable. You'll see in the trial.
And I think we need to get to the point where even a quasi-rogue bureaucrat understands that's a red line.
That's
correct.
Right.
And so losing a job, I mean, if someone actually ordered a murder,
yeah, it's not about losing jobs.
Losing a job is not the end of that story.
That's right.
And there's a criminal prosecution in the U.S. Just last week, a report came out of the Commission and Inquiry, which I and others, President insisted happened. And I said, and I'll say it here publicly too, we are satisfied that those steps so far have been taken. A commission was launched. They now are talking about recommendation for prosecutions inside the Indian system, and we'll watch those carefully, and I would hope the new administration will too, because that's non-negotiable. But second, I was with our press secretary in the embassy, and we were going on I was doing like 18 goodbye interviews with everybody, and he said, you know what, when the question's going to be like, isn't X about to derail U.S.-India relations? And this was his second tour. He's been serving on and off for about a decade. He said, if I could tell you how many times whatever it is that's the hot thing in U.S.-India relations is about to derail things and set it backwards. My experience as ambassador, because I was wary, when I picked up the phone after some of these things have landed, the next day would there be a retreat from? We saw what happened with Canada and how that was engaged. The next day, my Indian counterparts would double down and accelerate further the pace and the depth of what we were doing. What that showed is the resilience and the desire from India, because it's often written in Washington that Washington needs India so badly. When I think the deficit on trade, we're number one trading partner to India at a benefit to India, but India's our 12th right now, and we probably wouldn't feel it in our economy much. We'd feel our services shut down, but we wouldn't feel the economic impact on our jobs if we weren't trading with India tomorrow. Strategically, we've never been closer. We're the number one defense partner of them, et cetera, but are we really going to send troops and ships to each other's conflicts yet? That's, I think, some way off. So America actually has very little to lose, and it puts us in a negotiating standpoint of we want India, not we need India. We're not going to negotiate because we're not going to sacrifice our values, but we are going to look at each other as friends who can have frank conversations, and this is incredibly resilient and incredibly, we're desiring of this.
Can I add something? And I think that's a really good explanation, is that a lot of this has to do with, as the Indian diaspora in the United States and Canada grows, India is not just exporting a few people, it's exporting India.
Yep.
with all of the, all of the different points of view and the sort of religious and social conflicts and tensions that are in India, and now they're in the United States and Canada in certain ways. And, there in the U.S., we have things about somebody, you can say just about anything about anybody or any country in the United States, and you can say all kinds of inflammatory things, and that might make you a rude person or a foolish person, but it doesn't make you a criminal. And so, as the presence of the Indian diaspora in America grows and becomes more complicated, both its ties to India become stronger because there are more people connected to more parts of the country, but the tensions at one end are affecting the other. And this is not, we can't just say, okay, we had this one problem one time. What we're looking into is a situation that's only going to develop as, in a sense, paradoxically, as ties increase. Again, in general, the closer you are to another country, the more quarrels you have with them, not less. I mean, even before the latest U.S.-Canada, flare-ups, the U.S. has more trade fights with Canada than it does with almost any other country. Plywood, just the whole, I imagine even maple syrup causes problems, right? Those evil Canucks subsidizing their maple syrup. So the more closely you're intertwined, just like people have more fights with their spouses than they do with their fifth cousins. Okay? And as the U.S. and India become closer, we are going to have more things that we disagree about. And so we've got to get better at figuring out, okay, how do we manage these? Sure. And we are better because, as Eric says, these things are not derailing the relationship. We both know, okay, here is something that's erupted. It's a real problem. We see it in different ways. But our goal is not to win a fight over this problem. Our goal is to strengthen this relationship that matters to both of us.
Okay, my last risk before we go on to some questions is, hardliners in China make the following prediction of Donald Trump, because they like Donald Trump, that he will organize the world into spheres of influence, he'll strike a deal with China, he will betray Taiwan, he'll compromise American commitments to allies in Asia and divide the world into two, and that's fine. How bad would that be for India? So in other words, America's commitment on China is weaker than India's commitment on China.
I don't think much. If we're dating now, we're always worried the other's cheating on them with China. And
we've gone from a friend. I note this was supposed to be a special friendship, and it's got very special friendship.
And the marriage point is
friends with benefits now.
But love each other, but you get through the first fight, And
sorry, Eric.
But my behind-the-scenes look is no. We trust each other on China. We are very clear-eyed about China. Trump is a little different. That could happen, but I think at the end of the day, the infrastructure around Trump, Rubio, Waltz, you see folks who, even when we want calmer waters, and India wants calmer waters with China, we want calmer waters with China, nobody fundamentally thinks it's a shift in the way that it was in decades past. It is a managing of a relationship, it is not a tilt towards.
Anyone else like to talk to that?
There were people, sorry, go ahead.
I would agree with that. I think America needs India and would not sacrifice India for better relations with China. There are many other ways of getting better relations with China. Yeah. What I find might change a lot is America's relationship with Russia. And that might give India some comfort. But I sincerely hope that doesn't happen without a peace in Ukraine.
Understood.
Right. Yeah. Putin would hear that without a piece of Ukraine. Again, when India and China reached their latest border agreements, there were people in the United States who said, "Oh, is this is India cheating with China?" Mm-hmm. So I think we're both susceptible to this. Again, I think Trump, Modi may understand Trump. I don't claim to understand Trump, Donald Trump. But I do think that his bargaining approach, which we've seen in so many circumstances, is he sort of expands the realm of discussion. So on the one hand, I can give you everything you want and be the best friend you ever had, or, you know, I'm going to sack and burn your home and sell your children into slavery, right? You know, it's like, that's the way he goes at bargaining. And we can see him talking to China about, you know, mind-bending tariffs and everything else, or love, unlimited love. The reality is Xi Jinping is also a bargainer, and Xi Jinping has his red lines, and anybody who's ever tried to bargain with China knows that it's not always that easy to get them to budge where you would like them to. So I think reality is going to, in a somewhat messy and often unpredictable way, keep things moving. But we will see Xi Jinping, who's been fairly predictable over the years, might decide it's time for him to try to be unpredictable.
Roll the dice,
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we can fit in a few questions, and what we might do is just take them all in one big shot, put them to the panel, and then we'll end after that. Would you like to go first? And I think there's a mic, but if you could just say your question quickly, and then we'll organize who answers it in a bit.
Thank you. Yeah, my quick question is about the collaboration on IT between US and India. You know, there are lots of discussion about AI replacing the junior engineer. In Silicon Valley, some of the company claiming 80% of the code are written by the AI tool already. And you guys know there's lots of outsourcing junior engineer IT job to Indian for US tech company. This evolution might happen very fast. It may dramatically impact this industry and also even GDP of the Indian contributed by this part of the industry. So love to hear your comments on it. What is the preparation Indian thinking about?
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And there's a question at the back there, and then one beyond that, if we could do.
Yeah, hi. First, to Ambassador Garcetti, actually, I met you first week after you started your 2-year tenure in an Indian diaspora event in New Delhi.
Right.
So good to see you after, and thank you for serving our country. So I think my question is that, you know, someone who spent half my life in India, half in US, this is like, it was such a fabulously hosted discussion. But, you know, like, we are talking about 27 trillion US economy, $4 trillion Indian economy. We have people which you acknowledge are highly trained. But why we are still stuck to $45 billion deficit when we should be talking about $1 trillion partnership? Like, are there cultural mismatch? Like, you know, like when I wear my Indian American hat, I see no reason why India and America should be the best allies. When I wear my pure Indian hat, I still feel the same way. But I don't see it happening that way empirically. So anyhow, I would love to hear your views. Although Patrick left like the way Mr. Godrej left with his poetry, no room for any other discussion. Patrick left no room for any other question, but thank you.
Thanks. Okay, why don't we take the one at the back there? And I think we're probably going to have to stop after that just in the interest of time, but please go.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just came back from India, and I think the love story thing is fantastic, and I'm all for it. I just felt, you know, in terms of the climate, you know, I was just amazed to see the air quality in Delhi and in Bombay and Mumbai. And, you know, it just struck me that this, you know, here's a country that really is probably at the closest point of the bubble point, and it just seems like a tremendous amount of ambivalence and apathy about what's happening with the environment. And I know we're in this Trump world, maybe that's not top, but the fact is we see what's happening with fires and hurricanes, and the insurance markets are pretty much telling us what's happening. So, you know, could you at least talk about what you think India could be doing more and what the world could be doing more just to really come to grips with this in a not a virtual signaling way, but in a problem-solving way?
Okay, because we're out of time, what I'd like to do is ask the panel quickly to answer those 3 questions, and perhaps if they have a few minutes, you could each spend some time afterwards. And if you'd like to ask a question directly, we can do that. Okay, does AI kill the IT services industry?
To some extent, yes. Sorry, and you have a good question, and I think yes, it's going to be a pain point.
Okay.
Yeah, and see, from our perspective, we leverage AI within our development community, and we've seen a 30% increase in productivity, right? And as customers all over the world implement it, they'll see 30% productivity gains. But the growth that we are seeing is far higher, right? And so the IT industry in the next 3-4 years will employ 1.2 to 1.4 million people in India. So the way we look at our order books right now, I think the predictions are this will benefit because it will reduce costs. But what the customers are doing is they're taking this reduced cost and putting it into innovation and transformation. So it's going to be how, and I explained earlier, right, moving factories up the value chain, right? And so we're getting a lot of interest and investment from customers into all this. So it's going to generate more higher-ended jobs. So I don't see it as a job loss perspectively. The revenue pattern is going to shift from one bucket to another, and we'll retrain. If people have to be retrained, we'll retrain. Even in AI, right, we're not talking about AI working on its own. We're talking about human-AI collaboration, right? And so I really feel that all these technology changes, I'm an optimist, and I think it's going to increase growth, from that perspective.
From a smallish amount of trade to a lot more. I mean, I guess that's obvious. We'd all like that to happen, right? To your question. So I'm not sure there's much more to say on that, except that your sentiments.
Well, maybe this, that to understand the context in America, in American politics for this discussion, the trade deficit with China used to be very small. And so a lot of sort of average Americans are thinking, okay, we made one big mistake. We helped one Asian supergiant country become really rich, and it took a lot of jobs away from Americans, and now it's creating a security threat that we really have to take seriously. And you're telling me, you're the same person who told me 25 years ago that trade with China was perfectly fine. Now you're telling me that we have nothing to worry about with trade with India. All right, the average American voter is going to have some questions about that. And so it's extremely important to think through how that relationship grows and what, yes, a lot of the political impact will be very positive and better goods at better prices and lots of other things, but there will be points of tension, and it would be naive to think otherwise. And it may be small now, but it could grow quite dramatically, the trade deficit.
Well, perhaps the answer is in order to grow, it needs to be balanced. Otherwise, there'll be a problem.
Well, we need to build it cleverly if it's going to last.
Who wants to answer the nightmare question on the horrific?
I'll take it because I've been spending a lot. And by the way, it's going to take courage. It's going to need to be something narrow, and it needs to be mutually beneficial in trade. That's why I would say certain things that components are still made in the U.S. It can also be made in India, in defense, in consumer electronics, in semiconductors. Those are the places we have to do something narrow, mutually beneficial, win-win, and it's going to take courage. For the air quality, I grew up in Los Angeles when it was the worst air in America, where I think, in Los Angeles?
I was saying last week.
Oh yeah, I mean,
it still is.
But in Los Angeles with the fires, when they were saying it was 150 AQI, we were joking in Delhi, that's a day we go for a marathon run. I mean, we had a day that it was 1,789. The Indian counting stops at 500. Yes. Our embassy counter keeps going and takes in. It was 1,789 when 250 is so toxic. It's 11 and a half years of Delhiite's life. If you do the computation on 20 million people in that city, that's 2 million people who are going to be dead when they should be alive. Imagine that being a disease. It's estimated to be 2 to 3% of GDP growth that is lost right now in India at 6 to 7%, which could get to the 10% India needs to do to match China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, all the places that had 20 years of 10% growth. And there's only 20 years for us to get there before India has more people leaving the workforce than entering it. So beyond virtue signaling, actually like-mindeds have all set up a conversation with the Ministry of Health. It is typical air quality. Nobody's in charge of any one piece. It's 200,000 weddings in December in New Delhi, and you're not going to be the one wedding that doesn't have firecrackers. It's every farmer who still doesn't have a great Mahindra tractor, so they're going to burn their fields instead of trying to plow it up. It's the people in their car. It's 10 to 15 to 20% all different things. So you can clean up one, which like there is a lot less burning of the fields this year. It still went up to record levels. And what I said, it's really an issue of governance and of culture. If you don't have governance.
Are you trying to also distinguish just air quality versus just global warming, temperature rising, coal mines?
Don't have enough time for that. I'd love to talk after on that, but of course, yes. I mean, adding the biggest renewables in the world that is coming in India will still add the same amount in coal if we don't have nuclear renewables and storage there, which is something we've very aggressively, and I think for the Trump administration, you have to say it is China competition, not as climate change, just because that's a political reality. But if you make it China competition, China's winning the oil of the future. Let's help India actually build it instead. But the pollution side, I do think it comes from governments and then culture. Everybody has to own that clean air culture, which right now in India, it's kind of the government's problem, not mine.
Okay, so various thank yous. Thank you to you, sir, for an excellent and important issue raised right at the end on pollution. So thank you for that. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to our fantastic panel.
And to our incredible moderator.
And,
Yes.
well,